Have you ever wondered why Canada wasn't a part of the Revolutionary War? Why weren't our northern neighbors sending down friendly folks to Philadelphia bearing arms and jugs of maple syrup and witticisms to tell Benjamin Franklin? Why were there 13 American colonies and Canada? It might surprise you to learn that this was a question which also occurred to America's founding fathers, a query which ultimately compelled them to invade Canada twice. Canada, the state that wasn't. Today, right here on The Political Orphanage. Hello and welcome to The Political Orphanage, a home for plucky misfits and problem solvers. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton, and you know what? I like poutine. In fact, I quite like Canada. I don't want to brag, but I've been to Canada 3 times. Toronto's great. It's basically like if New York were run by NPR. And while I basically had to flee Montreal the weekend I was there due to a romantic escapade going sideways, I got along fine with all the Quebecers. So, good neighbors, those Canadians. I'm a fan. I like them. Last week on the show, we covered states that weren't in American history: Franklin, Nickajack, and Westphalia. On the accompanying bonus episode, we delved into the topic of why is it hard to make new states? There have been attempts to make new states, like the state of Jefferson or Lincoln, all for naught. How come? Turns out there are some very specific legal and political reasons which make reorganizing into new states all but impossible. This week, we're going to continue exploring states that weren't, but we're going to turn our eyes abroad to foreign countries that could have become U.S. states, that almost became U.S. states. The kickoff bonus episode, which has already dropped this week, is Why Trump Wants Greenland. And today we're going to concern ourselves with Canada, a nation which that same president has recently joked about annexing, although I don't think the Canadians found the joke quite as amusing. But it's not entirely out of the blue, is it? Because it turns out America has, in fact, invited Canada to join the party before. And then when they didn't, invaded. Multiple times. We've done that twice now. Unsuccessfully, in case you're curious. Now, I say Canada, but that's not exactly right. During the Revolutionary War between the American colonies and Great Britain, when we invaded Canada, Canada really just meant Quebec. Canada was a region of North America, not a country, not a culture. Pretty much anybody who talked about Canada, really up until the American Civil War, was talking about a region and not a people. Saying Canada was a little like saying North American, a term which could include us and Mexico, even though we're different countries. There aren't a lot of people who have strong North American identities. Canada itself did not confederate until 1867. Up until the end of the American Civil War, there was no Canada in the modern sense, no Dominion of Canada. Until that point, it was a handful of separate British colonies, which had more political connections to the motherland back in England than they did to Ottawa. But at the time of the Revolutionary War, Canada pretty much just meant Quebec, New France, as opposed to New England. And New France had only recently been conquered by the British about a decade earlier. They thought of themselves as Quebecois, or maybe as French Canadians, but most of them would have viewed themselves as conquered Frenchmen more than British subjects or Canadians. Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Prince Edward Island existed by the eve of the Revolutionary War, but they were small, unpopulated places, not semi-autonomous colonies like Virginia or Massachusetts. Newfoundland didn't even have an elected assembly. It was just a scattering of fishing villages with a governor directly appointed by Parliament. Although that did not stop us from inviting them to join the party. The Continental Congress invited both Quebec and Nova Scotia to send delegates to Philadelphia and join the family of rebellious British subjects in the American Revolution. Nova Scotia kind of made sense. Nova Scotia had a lot of similarities with us revolutionaries to the south. They were English-speaking, Protestant, And they did a lot of trading with New England. In fact, in 1776, a Nova Scotian by the name of Jonathan Eddy led a rebellion against the British, hoping to ignite a firestorm of patriotic sentiment and draw Nova Scotia into the war on the side of the Patriots. Jonathan Eddy had been born in New England, but he'd settled in Nova Scotia and was a member of its General Assembly. When the Revolutionary War broke out in Massachusetts in 1775, Eddy was rooting for America against King George. And as far as he was concerned, New Scotland, Nova Scotia, ought to be in the same orbit as New England. When the British cracked down on sedition in Nova Scotia, Eddy fled to Massachusetts, where he spent a lot of time hanging out with Sam Adams and trying to convince George Washington to give him money and guns. Money and guns. But Washington didn't see much strategic value in Nova Scotia. But he sent Eddy back with some muskets anyway, and Eddy was made a colonel in the Continental Army and given authority to raise a regiment in Nova Scotia. In November of 1776, Jonathan Eddy laid siege to Fort Cumberland, but failed to take it. When reinforcements arrived, Eddy's regiment scattered and fled to Massachusetts, and the British burned down the farms of the participants as punishment. And that was that. Nova Scotia would remain firmly in the British camp from there on out. But theoretically, had George Washington said, "By God, we've got to get a hold of more snow crabs," and sent a battalion to the north, Nova Scotia might well have come along with us for the ride. Quebec also declined the Continental Congress's invitation to send delegates to Philadelphia, but they couldn't have accepted the offer even if they wanted to. Quebec, what most people thought of as Canada, the principal European-based people of British Canada, Quebec was conquered. It was an occupied people. It was Frenchmen who'd been conquered by the British. There was no Quebec legislature, no Chateau de Burgesses, which could authorize delegates. And while Quebec was not under military rule, there were British troops garrisoned in Montreal and Quebec City. So if someone had tried to put together a meeting for the purpose of selecting delegates to send to Philadelphia, the British would have snuffed it out. But also, the Quebecois just didn't think it was a very good idea. They'd just been quashed by the Redcoats 12 years earlier. But the British had agreed to let them continue to speak French and use French civil law and practice Catholicism. That was a pretty good deal as far as they were concerned. Ally with these American upstarts to the south who appeared to just be quarrelsome Englishmen, and the British might conquer them again, but get pissed off and make them learn English. Quit eating beaver. Start eating potatoes. For that matter, the American upstarts themselves were all English-speaking Protestants, or mostly were English-speaking Protestants, and it wasn't entirely clear that they would be as tolerant of French-Canadian quirks as the British overlords were. So Quebec was a non-starter, despite multiple formal invitations from the Continental Congress to come hang out in Philadelphia. Also, we invaded it. In 1775, General Benedict Arnold convinced the Continental Congress that, Quebec really ought to be American. We're all colonials, aren't we? Hell, they hate the English even more than we do. They just need some motivation to join our cause. So here's what we'll do, lads. We'll send an army up into Canada to take out those British troops garrisoned in Montreal and Quebec City. Once we've secured those cities and driven out the Redcoats, we will be welcomed as liberators, and the grateful Quebecois, the Canadians, will rise up and join us, and we'll all eat poutine. And the whole exercise was just really poorly conceived. In 1775, the majority of the Continental Army was made up of short-term militias, whose enlistments were set to expire at the end of the year. So George Washington and Congress heard this pitch and went, well, if these dudes are all going to go back home to their farms here in a few days, we might as well use them to invade something while we still have an army. And so basically, because they were going to expire, America decided to invade Canada. And it was a shit show. Benedict Arnold convinced the Continental Congress to invade Montreal, but they passed over him to do it. They put another guy in charge. So, passed over, Benedict Arnold went to George Washington and he said, hey there, when we consider how tricky this whole Canadian liberation is, I've been thinking maybe we should have two armies get in on it. Like two different attacks. If you want, I guess I could lead the other army, the one that I'd originally asked to be in command of. So George Washington authorized Benedict Arnold to do a surprise attack on Canada, or specifically the British troops in Canada, via Maine. Arnold would lead his troops up through forests, streams, and the swamps of the Maine wilderness to sneak up on Quebec City, which would be caught entirely off guard for the very good reason that trying to march an army through New England swamps in the dead of winter is batshit crazy. And indeed it was. Arnold bought his maps from a surveyor with loyalist sentiments who almost certainly and deliberately obscured important details and added inaccuracies to the maps just to mess with him, which is probably why Benedict Arnold and his men ended up traveling 350 more miles than they'd originally anticipated, which is a long ways to walk. They did so mostly via boats, to be fair, but the boats kept leaking, which ruined their gunpowder and their food, and it also meant that the men were constantly wet. In winter, in New England, dysentery set in and everybody caught colds. A tree fell on a guy and killed him. By the time Benedict Arnold reached the Dead River, he decided to write letters to Washington and General Montgomery, the other general, informing them of his progress, most of which were immediately intercepted and turned over to the Lieutenant Governor of Quebec, thus eliminating the element of surprise and making his entire horrific, soggy expedition largely pointless. The men at the back of the army finally had to start eating shoe leather and candle tallow. Captain Henry Dearborn's dog was eaten, every single part, including the entrails, and afterwards they pounded up the bones to make broth. A third of these miserable, starving soldiers turned back before they even got to Canada. By the time Benedict Arnold arrived at the gates of Quebec City in a not surprise attack, his forces were 600 bedraggled, hungry men who had no cannons or field artillery. Arnold sent a guy with a white flag up to the gates and he said, "We are ready to accept your surrender," which presumably the British thought was, I want to be clear on this, it's not that he surrendered. They, showing up with a bunch of half-starved dudes and no artillery, walked up to the gates and said, "Are you ready to surrender, British?" Which presumably the British thought was a really funny joke. They did not take them up on it. The Americans retreated and they met up with Richard Montgomery and his army, the other army that Congress had passed over Benedict Arnold for. General Montgomery had had a much better time than Benedict Arnold or the dudes that ate a dog. Montgomery and his men had rolled into Point St. Charles there in Quebec, where he was, in fact, welcomed as a liberator. It's how it played out. The locals were like, "Hey, fellow colonial, here to smack around the hostile occupying British forces." Shortly thereafter, unable to adequately defend Montreal, the British withdrew and Montgomery took it with barely a fight. He sent out letters to the Quebecois, reminding them their presence was cordially requested in Philadelphia at the Continental Congress, and they ought to hold a convention to elect some delegates to send down to Philadelphia, and then assured them that as friends and neighbors of the Canadians, of the Quebecois, the American people and the Continental Congress would respect and tolerate the Catholic religion. Montgomery and Arnold met up, and they decided to try to take Quebec City, bringing the province firmly under American control. But the Continental Army was outnumbered, and they attacked anyway during a snowstorm on December 31st, 1775, which wasn't a very good idea for multiple reasons. But remember, most of these soldiers' enlistments were set to expire at the beginning of the year. It's December 31st. They all go home on January 1st. We got one day to do it. So America literally attacked because they thought the army would go home the next day. And this was a use it or lose it situation. And both happened. They used it and they loosed it. The invasion was a disaster. General Montgomery led his men, sword unsheathed and outstretched, through a blinding blizzard to the outskirts of Quebec City, where he was instantaneously killed by grape shot, which is basically like if a cannon and a shotgun had a baby. Benedict Arnold managed to penetrate the city, but then his men got lost in it, and their cannon got stuck in the snow, all while British militiamen shot down at them and lobbed hand grenades from the city walls. Multiple detachments suddenly lost the ability to fire their guns when America's gunpowder got damp. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the battle was over, in what was the very first defeat for the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. Over 400 Continental soldiers were captured, including 2/3 of Benedict Arnold's men. Arnold retreated to the outskirts of Quebec City, and the following day, a significant amount of the remaining men departed once their enlistment papers expired. But Arnold was determined to lay siege. He used his remaining artillery to shell the city, artillery he'd taken from Montgomery, to shell the city, but it didn't really have any effect on British defenses. It mostly just destroyed homes of civilians that they were there to theoretically liberate. Meanwhile, amidst sub-zero temperature, smallpox broke out amongst the Continental Army. In part because the British commander of the city, a man named Governor Carleton, thought it was funny to send prostitutes who had already contracted smallpox into the American enemy lines. Arnold ran out of gold coins to pay supplies, so he started paying the local French Canadians with paper money, which they didn't trust and didn't want, and when they refused to take it, the American army began confiscating what it needed from the locals at bayonet point. Back in Montreal, a man named General Wooster was holding the place down for the Americans, and he did a terrific job of obliterating any goodwill that had previously been achieved under General Montgomery. He was a Connecticut Puritan who hated Catholics, and in his brief tenure over that area, confiscated crown property, threatened to banish the Jesuits, refused to acknowledge that Catholic priests were actually legitimate clergy, and demanded that the people there swear loyalty oaths to the American cause. It was bad enough that Benjamin Franklin and the man who would become the first American Catholic bishop came to Montreal to try a charm offensive to undo the damage and just butter up all the locals until they became American. But by then, even the wiles and libido of Benjamin Franklin were insufficient. The entire Canadian liberation had expired. Our inability to take Quebec City did not inspire confidence in our cause, nor did the paper money we kept trying to buy provisions with. And in any case, the Quebecois really just wanted the ability to practice Catholicism unimpeded, and they already had that under the British. When British reinforcements came in the summer, Arnold and Wooster retreated, and any prospect of an American Quebec disappeared. Not for want of trying. In the Paris peace talks at the end of the Revolutionary War, Benjamin Franklin demanded that Britain hand over Quebec as spoils of war, but to no avail. Then, war broke out again, with Britain in 1812, and the United States, once more, invaded Quebec to try to bring it into the fold, again, to no avail. Arguably, American incursions in the War of 1812 are the point at which Canadians began to see themselves as Canadians. By the way, Canadian listeners, I would love to hear from you on this one. I don't know how much of this is taught in Canadian schools. I also don't know how much of this is me putting an American slant on it, so I would genuinely love to hear from you. I would also love to know what you think of as kind of the Canadian origin story and to what extent we play a role in it. From where I'm at, I think it's us invading Canada in 1812, where there begins to be a Canadian identity, not Frenchmen living in Canada as Quebecois, or Englishmen living on the east coast of North America, or Scotsmen living in Nova Scotia. That had been the old identity, but as a new group, unto themselves, loyal to the crown, but not wanting to be absorbed into America. And if that's not when the Canadian identity began to happen, America definitely helped out later. Remember, Canada doesn't confederate until 1867. That's really when Canada becomes Canada. But the reason it confederated rather than staying multiple separate colonies was in large part because of the Irish. You thought I was going to say Americans. And technically, you're right. Actually, I should say Irish Americans did this. The Fenian Brotherhood was an Irish Republican organization based in the United States, which decided to put pressure on the British to withdraw from Ireland by more or less randomly raiding British custom posts and military fortifications in Canada. Basically, it was a branch of the IRA or whatever precipitated the IRA in America, and it decided to attack British stuff in Canada out of solidarity with the Irish across the pond, which prompted the various separate colonies that would become Canada to finally go, hey now, we might need to become a country to defend ourselves from this stuff. Although not all of Canada felt that way. Most of the Canadian provinces that we know and love today either confederated into the Dominion of Canada in 1867 or they joined shortly thereafter. With one exception, Newfoundland. Newfoundland kept doing its own thing. The island of Newfoundland was one of Britain's oldest overseas possessions. Newfoundland had its own government and identity going back as far as the 1600s, and Newfies did not view themselves as Canadians. They viewed themselves as Newfies. So they created their own dominion in 1907. So that is to say, as of 1907, the year that Oklahoma became a state and my grandfather was born, North America consisted of 4 countries: Mexico, the United States, the Dominion of Canada, and Newfoundland, which also included Labrador, which is where Labrador retrievers are from. During the Great Depression, Newfoundland's economy imploded, and they basically forfeited their autonomy as a dominion and went back to direct rule from Great Britain. But by the 1940s, it was increasingly clear that Newfoundland would prosper as a component of a larger country with a larger economy and a military than by doing its own thing. And during that time, this is late in the game, by the way, we're up to the 1940s. During that time, there was a decent push in Newfoundland to join the United States. World War II had just wrapped up, and pro-American sentiment was at an all-time high. Everybody loved America. I found an article researching today's episode which states that in one poll, 80% of Newfoundlanders favored joining the United States at that time. Now, that polling is debatable. I have found references in newspaper articles to that poll, but I have not found the poll itself. So it's probably just a local newspaper doing an informal poll of readers, or maybe just making it up in hopes of drumming up support for joining America. But in any case, it could have happened. There were people in Newfoundland that wanted to join the United States, and it wouldn't have been so crazy. Our economy was doing gangbusters after the war. We already had military bases in Newfoundland. And while it would not have been connected to the continental United States, Newfoundland itself is closer to New England than it is to most of Canada. It's closer to New York than it is to Alberta. If the United States had tried to purchase Newfoundland, it almost certainly would have become an American state because we would have purchased Newfoundland from themselves. We would have just given them cash as a buyout in exchange for joining the Union. But by the 1940s, there was zero political appetite for Newfoundland joining the United States within the United States. We no longer wanted bits of Canada. By then, the Cold War was heating up, and we didn't want to piss off our British allies by stealing their gal. Yeah, it'd be kind of cool if we could annex the homeland of Labrador retrievers. If America included the homeland of Labrador retrievers, that would actually be super cool. And it's probably wonderful in the summer. But otherwise, there just wasn't a really compelling interest to American geopolitical strategy. We had generous leases there on our military bases, and respectfully to the good people of Labrador and Newfoundland, we already had enough lobsters and snow crabs. It just wouldn't be worth it to juggle a diplomatic tightrope act with the collapsing British Empire, let alone marshal the votes necessary in Congress to formally authorize such a thing, which would, of course, invoke the question of, well, are they going to go Democrat or Republican? Because that's going to be a sticky issue. So no formal overtures were ever made of Newfoundland petitioning to join the Union or the United States offering to annex it. In 1948, Newfoundlanders held a referendum on whether to revert to self-rule as a British dominion, to remain under direct control of Parliament, or to join the nation of Canada. And they chose to become Canadian. Barely. In fact, there are people right now who are alive that were born in Newfoundland when it was an independent country and not in Canada. I'm told there are people in Newfoundland that talk about when they leave the island to go to the mainland, they're going to Canada, as if Canada is a separate thing. But for a lot of them, it was when they were born. So those are the various points at which Canada or parts of Canada might have become the United States. Nova Scotia actually kind of made sense, and there was a little bit of desire for that to happen, but there just wasn't enough of a strategic reason to back it, and so it never came over. But for the most part, Canada, at the time of the Revolutionary War, wasn't Canada in the sense that we understand it today. When you read about Canada during the Revolutionary War, you're really reading about Quebec, which is to say that you're reading about people that would have viewed themselves as Frenchmen living in North America. And they didn't have the same sense of colonial brotherhood that Virginia and Massachusetts shared. They'd had a different history and they had a different setup. And so didn't send delegates down to Philadelphia and also didn't take us up on our invitation to join the party and become a part of the United States. But could have been Quebec, could have been Nova Scotia, could have been Newfoundland if history had gone just a little bit different. Any one of those could have been an American state. All three of them could have been American states. Gang, if you found today's topic interesting, I want you to know there's a bonus episode already waiting for you on Greenland. In the same way that America tried multiple times to obtain Canada or parts thereof, America's tried to purchase Greenland several times, going back to the 19th century. In fact, by my count, we've tried more often to obtain Greenland than we've tried to take any part of Canada. Also, we accidentally dropped a nuclear bomb on it one time. Don't worry, it didn't go off, but we did accidentally drop a nuclear bomb on Greenland one time. We cover all of that on the bonus episode, and more specifically, we get into the question of, what's so great about Greenland? Well, it turns out Greenland's actually an increasingly important strategic landmass for any major global player. And as Greenland increasingly drifts towards independence, there's a soft power tug of war starting between the United States and two other big powers that I mention in that particular episode to see whose orbit Greenland and all of its strategic positioning falls into. You can listen to that episode and a slew of other bonus episodes by going to thepoliticalorphanage.com, which will now take you to Substack, because the Political Orphanage has expanded into Substack. Now, don't worry, if you're already on Patreon, you will still get content, as per usual. Don't worry. But I think Substack is a lot of fun, and I'm going to start putting my shoulder into it and playing around with it, and I think it'll be a great place for our community to grow. Now, a few of you have reached out to me over the last few days and said, hey, I'm already on Patreon. Should I bolt over to Substack? My position is this. I am exceedingly grateful to everyone who makes this show possible, and so my preference is that you do whatever is best for you. That is what I want you to do. Whatever makes you feel like you're getting value and is easiest for you, do that. I don't want to invite any work or irritation into your life. I'm very grateful for allowing mine to exist as it is. But I do know that there are many of you who already are on Patreon and Substack, and you like Substack more. So if that's the camp for you, by all means, jump over. If you already have an account over there and you're on the fence, I think you'll have more fun at Substack. So make the jump. Let's get that group chat percolating. And if you're new to the program, you don't know any of the stuff that I'm talking about, don't worry. What I mainly want to communicate to you is there's way more content on the patron side of this. There's 2 episodes per week. One of them's on the main feed. One of them's behind it. Check it out. Go sign up. Go to thepoliticalorphanage.com. That's thepoliticalorphanage.com. Now on Substack. That's the show. Thanks for listening. Thank you, patrons who make it all possible. Thank you, Nation of Canada, specifically Quebec, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland. I'm going to throw in Alberta because it's my favorite. Thanks for being such good neighbors and for putting up with my shenanigans. Until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, and so have you.
So, hearty friends and neighbors, as the next election looms, if come that fateful Tuesday, you are filled with doubt and gloom. Stand your post and fight the powers with whom you have so much beef. Forswear all wicked temptations to go and join the Maple Leaf. Do not go north, in disappointment Sally's for. Sally or Moreland still has me of you and more than the frigid north. When you feel that great despondence, lose not sight of July 4th. Uncle Sam despises quitters, all who flee to the deep north. You would have to get a lawyer and do years of paperwork. Go get married for a passport to some flannel-wearing jerk. Labrador is a fine neighbor, sure Alberta is okay. But have you at all considered they won't want you anyway? Do not go north, in disappointment Sally's forth. Your homeland still has need of you more than the frigid north. When you feel that great despondence, lose not sight of July 4th. Uncle Sam despises quitters, all who flee to the deep north. What would you even do there, talk in French and eat poutine? You hate winter, you hate hockey, you have never liked curling. Spend your days inside Tim Hortons, go adopt a moose or bear. But sure go off to Canada and see if I will care. Do not go north, do not go north, do not go north, when there's a point when Sally's forth. Your homeland still has need of you more than the frigid north. When you feel that great despondence, lose not sight of July 4th. Uncle Sam despises quitters, all who flee to the deep north. Do not go north, do not go north, there's a point when Sally's forth. Do not your homeland has need of you more than the frigid north. Do not go north, USA, USA, Uncle Sam take flakes and quitters, all who flee to the deep north.
Thank you, Mr. Jenkins and the Hoofbeats. They are joined, as always, by Elmer the Songhorse, who helps them keep rhythm. They are the resident performers here on Sundays for the Gospel Choir Brunch. You can catch them every week at